All right. Hello, everybody. So I have had a couple of questions related to one of the conversations that I had at one of our previous lives, which I had this slide on there. I think I was talking about creatine in that conversation, but what I want to talk about today is the questions that I got, which is what are the best exercises for losing fat, for losing weight? Should I choose my exercise based off of burning carbs versus fat? Should I be choosing exercises that primarily burn fat instead of carbs if that's my goal? So I want to address those questions today, and then also questions related to how should I fuel for a workout, depending on what it is. So I want to go over this slide again, and then I'm going to get a little bit more in depth of what type of fuel your body uses. Are you using fat? Are you using carbs? Are you using both? Related to what type of exercise you're doing, and should you choose your exercises based off of wanting to lose fat mass? Okay, so really quickly, I just want to go over again this idea of what we use as fuel for various types of exercise. So if you are doing a very explosive movement, whether it is a 100-yard dash or anything shorter than that, a 1-rep max lift, anything like that, your body's actually using in that moment primarily creatine. So creatine is technically a fuel source. It's used in the first couple of seconds of an exercise, specifically something that's explosive. So we did talk a lot about creatine in that live, so you can go back and watch that. I also have a lot of information in the supplements classroom related to creatine, and I'm happy to answer any creatine related questions that you have. Not super common that most people are doing like these incredibly explosive type movements all the time, unless you're like a professional athlete or a power lifter. Next thing is going to be something that's like a couple minutes long, higher intensity exercise. So I have like a floor routine in gymnastics as an example here with Simone Biles, but this would be anything like anywhere up to like half a mile running, any sort of like moderate intensity type class. And we'll kind of go through in the next slide what that might look like. So anything above those first couple of seconds, if you are still getting your heart rate up for the activity, you are using primarily carbohydrates. Carbs are typically your primary fuel until you hit about that 30 to 60 minute mark. So if you're going on a run that lasts for less than an hour, for example, you are using primarily carbohydrates to fuel that activity. If you are going to Pilates class, for example, you are using primarily carbohydrates as long as your heart rate gets above a certain extent. Obviously, something that does have both explosive and moments of rest, so something like lifting, maybe a HIIT class, something like that, that is going to use primarily carbohydrates as your fuel source. The next thing that I have here is our endurance, right? So that'd be anything above anywhere from like 60 to 75 minutes. That is going to use a combination of both carbohydrate and fat. And we'll look at that in the next slide. So you are using both carbs and fat for anything that gets your heart rate up and lasts roughly more than an hour. And then lastly, I have here your rest state or your low intensity exercises. So that's going to be something like walking, maybe a yoga class. You are actually burning primarily fat, particularly if you are keeping your heart rate below a certain threshold. So typically a good gauge for this is, are you able to still have a conversation very easily? And if so, then you are still in that low intensity threshold. So in those moments, you are burning primarily fat as your first fuel source. So I think sometimes people hear this and they think, well, my goal is to burn fat, and therefore maybe I should do lower intensity exercises to achieve this goal of burning fat. So I'm going to get through this next slide here because I do want to kind of not debunk, but talk through how we think about that. Okay, so what I have here is a graph. So I did get this infograph off of Nutrition Tactics. You can see the Instagram handle there. And then you can see at the bottom the research article that this was pulled from. But basically what this is looking at is, what are you using as your primary source of fuel based off of your activity? So we have 4 different exercise variances down there. You have at rest, you have 40% intensity. So 40% intensity is that low intensity. So again, that would be like that walk. And again, sort of the sniff test, if you will, is are you able to hold a conversation very easily, this level of intensity, but your heart rate's up a little bit. So this wouldn't be totally sitting around having a conversation, obviously. That's a very low intensity exercise as well, right? But this is, you're up, you're active, you're moving, but you are still able to carry that conversation. The next would be that moderate intensity level. So this is going to be heart rate's a little bit more elevated, conversation's a little bit harder to be had, but it's certainly not a max effort. And then that last thing is that high intensity. So again, that would be something like a very fast lap around the track, or doing maxing lifting, something like that, where you definitely would not be able to hold a conversation in that. What's not on this chart is like the extreme end of absolute maxing out, right? So again, that would be that like total sprint. We have here what the majority of people are doing for exercise. So the first thing I want to take a look at is, you can see here the 4 different types of fuel sources. So we have muscle glycogen. What is that? So that is actually the carbohydrates that your body has stored in your muscle. So you can actually store about 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates in your muscle. So a lot of times people think that carbohydrates immediately gets converted into fat if you don't use it for energy. That's actually not the case. So you have about 2,000 calories worth of energy stored as carbs in the form of glycogen in your muscle. And the reason for that is it's there ready to be used instantly. It's there for whenever your body needs to do any sort of movement. So that's why we hold on to that sort of immediate fuel source. The next one we have is plasma glucose. So that is any glucose, or glucose means sugar, anything that's in your blood. So if you have eaten something recently and the sugar is just still circulating in your blood, we always have a certain level of glucose that stays in our blood. That's a normal healthy range, right? So this would be anything that's just sort of floating in the blood at the moment. The next one is going to be plasma-free fatty acids. So that's going to be fat that is in your blood. So again, that might be something that you've eaten recently, or that might be because your body has broken down fat and is circulating that fat to be used as energy. And we'll get into it, but typically that's what you're going to see in more of that lower intensity stuff. And then other fat sources. So fat hangs out in other places as well. You do have some intermuscular fatty acids as well. So just know, essentially here, what we're looking at is carbs coming from either storage in your muscle or storage in your blood, and fat, again, either from you breaking down body fat and it is circulating in your blood, or potentially coming from your muscles as well. So as you can see here, yes, at rest, you are using primarily, if you kind of look at like the percentage there, free fatty acids, so primarily fat, and then you have a little bit of plasma glucose. So basically, when you're at rest, you're basically just using whatever happens to be digesting. If you've just eaten something, you're going to use up that for your energy, and then also potentially tapping into any fat storage that you have. So this is where you would break down body fat and use body fat as fuel. So let me get to the next one. Okay, so low intensity exercise. This is where a lot of people think, I need to be doing more of this because it burns more fat. Well, let's take a look here. So yes, comparative to higher intensity exercises where you can see that you are using significantly more carbs as fuel, yes, the lower intensity uses more percentage of fat. That's correct. So you'll see roughly half is coming from fat and roughly half is coming from carbs. Maybe 60% is coming from fat and 40% is coming from carbs. Compare that to the higher intensity, where when you get to that highest intensity level, you're using almost 80% of your fuel from carbs and only about 20% from fat. However, if you look at the amount of actual fat that's being burned, you'll see that it's very even between the low intensity and the moderate intensity. You're burning almost the exact same amount. And yes, you're burning a little bit less when you look at those high intensity, but then we have to look at calories. So again, just because the percentage that you're burning is more percentage fat than carbs, it ultimately comes down to how many calories are you burning versus how many calories are you taking in a day. So if you're relying on low intensity activities like let's just say, for example, walking as your primary source of activity because you are trying to lose body fat, that's great. And in the actual movement of walking, yes, you are going to be burning fat, but you're going to be burning significantly less calories doing that activity than doing something more intense. And so at the end of the day, you still have a lower amount of calories that you have burned in a day. And so you have less of a calorie budget to work with in terms of trying to be in a deficit versus if you had done something that was higher intensity for the same amount of time, you would burn significantly more calories and pretty equal amounts of fat. So again, if you look at the difference even between the low intensity, which is that 40% intensity, and that high intensity, which is that 75% intensity, the total amount of fat burned just between those two activities is very, very similar, but you burn way more calories. That's where the y-axis is coming from, is that's your energy expenditure. You burn way more total calories and almost equal amounts of fat doing the high intensity. And so not only did you burn essentially the same amount of fat, maybe a little bit less, but you have way more calories that you've burned in the equal amount of time. And so you have an opportunity for a greater calorie deficit, or if you were to, accidentally eat a few extra 100 calories a day or whatever it is, you have more of a calorie balance to work with. Now let's talk about that rest category, because again, a lot of people hear, well, you burn fat when you're at rest. And then they think, well, I don't want to work out then because then all I'm doing is burning carbs. Again, look at the difference between how many actual calories worth of fat that you're burning at rest versus any of the other activities. Significantly less. So yes, while the primary fuel source while you're at rest is fat, that doesn't mean that you're burning a lot of it. So it's really important to keep all of that into consideration because again, a lot of people like to steer away from activities that are fueled mostly or fueled percentage-wise more by carbs because they think that they want to burn more fat. And so they need to choose an activity that burns more fat. But again, we're talking about percentage of calories that are burned, and you are going to burn way less calories doing a low intensity activity than you are doing a high intensity activity. And again, the total amount of fat burned in terms of calories is actually very, very similar between the three. So ultimately, there's no benefit to choosing low intensity activities for fat burn. Now, if you like low intensity activities, if you like to add that to your day, if you like to do that as your morning workout, if you're just trying to generally be a little bit more active, so you're adding something like a walk into your day, obviously that's great. I'm not discouraging low intensity activity. It's great for heart health. It's great for just having that like low intensity, like longer type sustained increased heart rate. Like all that is great for health. So again, I'm not discouraging it, but what I am saying is if you are only choosing that activity over something else because you think you're burning more fat or you're going to be more successful at fat loss, I did want to sort of dispel that. All right. So like I said, the next question I then typically get is like, how should I be fueling for my workout? And of course, like any good dietitian, my answer is it depends. So let me caveat this by saying this answer is sort of within the context of assuming that you've eaten some sort of meal within the last 4 hours. If you have not eaten a meal within the last 4 hours, then I would recommend the upper end of the recommendation and maybe potentially a little bit more as we get more intense. So for low intensity exercise, again, this would be something like a walk, doing a slow yoga class, not like the crazy, hot, move really quickly yogas. I understand those are a little bit closer to the moderate intensity, but if it's just a stretching type yoga, something like that, you really don't need to fuel for that. Because again, there's just amount of calorie burn that you're going to experience in that type of exercise really doesn't require a whole lot of extra calories and a whole lot of extra fuel. Now, again, if you have not eaten anything up to this point, I would recommend up to that 30 grams of carbs. But if you've eaten a meal within the last couple of hours and you just want to go on a walk, you really don't need to fuel that necessarily. So if you are on that 30 gram of carbs, so let's say you haven't eaten anything, maybe it's the first thing you do in the day, something like that. We'll get some examples on the next slide of what roughly 30 grams of carbs looks like. But that might be an applesauce, a single size applesauce, a handful of crackers, something like that. Next thing is a moderate intensity. So that would be something like a lighter lift. So we'll get into high intensity. That's more of like that Olympic lifting, power lifting, really, really heavy. If you're doing a lighter lift, if you're doing a light jog, if you're going on a bike ride, again, a higher intensity yoga type class, something like that. Again, if you have eaten within the last couple of hours, again, maybe don't need to necessarily fuel specifically for that activity. So again, that recommendation is anywhere from 0 to 30. If you're feeling hungry or it's been a couple of hours since you've eaten, absolutely you can fuel for that activity, and about 30 grams of carbs would be appropriate. But if you've eaten recently, you're not that hungry, again, it's not something that you like need to fuel for to have the best outcomes for that workout. You should be okay if you've eaten within the last couple of hours and you're not feeling particularly. The next thing is going to be that high intensity. So this is going to be a run that lasts anywhere from like 30 to 75 minutes. Now, this is not a 30-minute jog. This would be like a, going for a PR 5K kind of intensity that I'm talking about here, if it's that shorter end, or, a run that gets your heart rate up pretty high into your, more zone 3, 4, 5 area. Powerlifting, again, like a really heavy, intense, really spike your heart rate up lifting session. A team sports practice. So if you're somebody who does soccer or basketball or something like that, recreationally, or you are on one of those teams, obviously those are very intense workouts typically. So that's when we're really going to start intentionally fueling for these exercises. So this is where 30 grams of carbs within an hour of this activity is going to be appropriate. If your activity lasts for more than anywhere from 60 to 75 minutes, that's where you want to start thinking about fueling during the activity as well. So I have here this endurance greater than 75 minutes category. So for something like this might be a long run. Maybe you're going on a two-hour run. Maybe you have a 2 to 3 hour sports practice, something like that. You would want to not only consume 30 grams of carbs before the workout, but also the recommendation is 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour of the actual workout. So if you've ever seen like those gels, especially if you're a runner or a biker, that's where those can come in handy. This is where sports drinks are really applicable, right? Like I've talked about electrolytes and sports drinks, and generally speaking, most people don't need Gatorade all day long, but this is where something like a Gatorade or another type of sports drink would be really helpful, because that's what they're for, to give you quick energy, give you quick carbs, and give you a little bit of electrolytes. Energy waffles, stuff like that are going to be appropriate both within an hour before and then also during the activity itself. And again, you want to look to get about 30 to 60 grams of carbs during the activity per hour that you're working out. So if you're doing a 4-hour bike ride, that would be 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour. So roughly 200-ish total grams of carbs for that activity. And I just wanted to throw in here in case somebody wanted some visuals of what that might look like, that 30-ish grams of carbs. That's going to be an individual thing of pretzels, a Nutri-Grain bar, an applesauce squeeze, a banana. Again, these are sort of those like on the go, if you're running or biking or whatever it is, those little gel packs, stuff like that. So obviously, particularly some of these choices, these are going to be higher in refined carbohydrates, higher in sugar. And obviously, typically, this is something that I talk about limiting, or, limiting ultra processed foods, stuff like that. However, these are the situations that these types of foods are appropriate, is right before an intense workout, because again, you're going to break this food down. You want to absorb those sugars really quickly. And then going back to what I was saying with what fuel is your body using, a lot of the times you're using the sugar that's in your blood, right? So you're going to use your reserve fuel that's already in your muscles, and you're going to use whatever you've eaten within the last hour or two. So you want to have some energy, which is sugar, carbohydrates available in your blood. So that's when foods like this are absolutely appropriate, which is why I don't ever like to say to always eat something or never eat something. I think that there's a time and place for most foods, and that's where these sort of refined ultra-processed foods are super handy and super appropriate. But also, portions are important, right? So again, 30 to 60 grams of carbs, or 0 to 30 or 30 to 60 if you're in the middle of a long exercise, that's maybe one Nutri-Grain bar, right? So portions are important as well. But yeah, so I hope that that answered any questions that you guys might have if you were asking about that. Thank you for those questions. I had a handful of those come in. So if you have any questions related to any of these lives that we've done, anything that I post, please let me know. And thanks for watching.